Well, I just couldn't believe there was a massive conspiracy. We were asked to believe that hundreds, if not even thousands, of members of the Greek community had got together and conspired to overcome the social security laws of this country with each other, when many of them, some of them in fact, were illiterate in their own language. None of them had any knowledge of our legal system or social security system much at all. It was just too far-fetched that there was this extraordinary conspiracy amongst all these people. And in fact, there were a lot of people who had great unease at the time. But the government and the bureaucracy, some members of the bureaucracy, just felt they had to defend everything they'd done over and over again. And that's the story, I think, behind this sad and sorry case.
Inspector Thomas's hope that police would arrest 1,000 people proved wildly optimistic. Staff inadequacies and the sheer volume of paperwork forced the police to halt after 181 arrests. Everyone was charged with conspiracy, which is a serious criminal offence carrying a jail sentence of up to 5 years.
My first impressions of the case were of course formed before I came onto the case. And like everybody else, I believe these people to be guilty, especially because of the magnitude of the media and the interviews that the police, like Don Thomas, gave the media, implicating all these Greeks. And I'd never assumed that people would be making statements like that unless they had evidence to prove the charges. After I took on the case, I got to meet the patient defendants whom we represented, and it became evident to me that these people were either severely physically ill or mentally ill, and I began to question the validity of the allegations made against them.
Before the case could be launched, both the prosecution and the defence lawyers needed to know the details of the crime that these people were supposed to have committed.
Well, it's a pretty fundamental principle of law that a person charged is entitled to have some details of the charge. That's called particulars of the charge. Now, in this case, the defence were attempting to get some detail of this conspiracy against their clients, and the prosecution came to court saying that they hadn't been able to obtain those from the police.
Over the next year, the start of the hearing was postponed 4 times, simply because the police were unable to provide the particulars to substantiate their sweeping allegations.
I am, and I remain concerned at the Crown's failure and apparent inability to provide any particulars of its case.
With hindsight, one can only assume that the Crown failed to provide those particulars because they just didn't have them. It was a case of proceeding and hoping to find the evidence to fit the charges, not the other way around, which is the orthodox way.
The first major cracks in the case appeared 9 months after the arrests, when charges against 13 patient defendants were dropped, even before the hearing had begun.
The judge asked the prosecutor to present evidence in the court of me, and the prosecutor says no evidence. And the judge says that, you mean you don't have any evidence for Mr. Retas, and you bring this man to court and you put him in jail with 5 children, and then the charge has been dropped. So I was very happy that I've been free.
Despite being cleared of any wrongdoing, Matthew and his family had to endure further persecution by their neighbours.
The neighbours was very crook to us. They didn't want to talk to us. The neighbours children tell us that I was a crook and a criminal. And we have quite a few times broke our windows and knock our doors and close our light off and close the water off, and they broke the windscreen of our car. So many stupid things. So we left the house in Mandurah and we went to Coober Pedy, and we live since then to Coober Pedy.
Coober Pedy is a remote opal mining town in the South Australian desert, where Matthew and his family still live today. Meanwhile, in Sydney, there was a growing suspicion that those arrested were not criminals, but victims of a government campaign to scare people off, claiming welfare benefits. With a case against them continually being postponed through police ineptitude, this awareness began to spread. In fact, the Deputy Crown Solicitor who was directing the prosecution was on the verge of dropping charges against many of those accused because of the apparent lack of evidence against them. The case was back on the front page, this time because the police operation was being revealed as a blunder of major proportions. In an effort to prevent the case from collapsing even before it had started, Inspector Thomas turned again to his secret association with Chris Narkis. As part of their original scheme, Narkis had been arrested and released on bail with everyone else in April 1978. Only Thomas and Narkis knew that his arrest was simply a ploy to disguise their collaboration. Then, several months later, Thomas had Narkis called into police headquarters. In a consummate piece of play acting, Thomas and Narkis pretended that they had not been working together. Thomas interrogated Narkis as if he was an agent of the so-called conspiracy who had been caught demanding a $200 introduction fee from an undercover policeman.
Yanalakis further informs me that after leaving the home of Demos, he paid you the sum of $200 for the introduction to Demos. Have you anything to say about that?
No.
Narkis played along with the charade, and over the next 5 months, the deception was developed and resulted in a police file. It portrayed Narkis as a confessed member of the alleged racket, who was now willing to tell about everyone he knew to save himself from prosecution.
Well, let's go over this part about the undercover policeman.
The piece de resistance of this file was a 49-page statement which Thomas helped Narkis to write over a period of 2 days. Not surprisingly, it incriminated almost all of those patients against whom charges would otherwise have been dropped.
He had just been back to Greece and he knew Peter Simmons. OK?
Thomas knew that this statement contained lies and was a manifest perversion of the truth.
Hello, Don. How are you?
David?
Nevertheless, he presented it to the prosecution as the evidence needed to launch the case without disclosing the way in which it had been obtained. The purpose of this intricate and bizarre deception was to hide the fact that Narkis stood to gain a huge reward for incriminating as many of those on trial as possible.
Okay, good.
On the evidence of Narkis, there was this loose-knit association which he called kolpo, which apparently is a Greek word meaning the trick. And on Narkis's evidence, Narkis's statement certainly, it was a general conspiracy in that there was interaction between the doctors and interaction between the beneficiaries themselves to assist each other. And that evidence was considered, together with other evidence, that it was capable of proving a general conspiracy.
On the 26th of March 1979, almost a year to the day after the first arrests, the Crown finally opened its case.
We now propose, Your Worship, to give an outline of evidence expected to be given by what may be called major Crown witnesses, whose evidence relates to more than one individual defendant. Now, the first of such witnesses with whom we propose to make reference is a co-conspirator arrested and charged, but in respect of whom the Crown has given an indemnity. His name is Chris Narkis.
Without Narkis, it is highly unlikely that the case would ever have been launched. Narkis was in fact the star witness for the prosecution, and the whole case hinged on the credibility of his evidence. But it was obvious from the start that his testimony was riddled with inconsistencies. For example, central to his allegations against the doctors was his claim to have obtained sickness certificates from them without being ill. Yet, when cross-examined, he admitted that he really had been ill, which undermined his entire story.
Yes.
And that you might have had vomiting problems in 1977.
Yes.
And that you might have had dizziness problems in 1977.
Yes.
And then you might even have had irritability problems in 1977.
Yes.
Even though much of his testimony had been unbelievable, Narkis was released by the court and returned to Greece, still hopeful of a reward payout. At around the same time, Inspector Thomas flew to Greece. It was his third trip in search of evidence which could be used to prop up what was proving to be a very shaky case.